This is our second year. We had, three other guys and I, had the fifth floor suite, and in between, in the fourth floor suite, was the director of resident housing.
Correct.
Proceed.
And in our suite, there was a closet that was tiled from floor to ceiling, and there were some patched over areas, which that closet was formerly a very large bathroom. And on that, I think it was the second floor, there was a dark room, small little dark room. And we were supposed to do some black and white work, but we decided that it would be nice if we could do our own color. And what we did was we cut the pipes and made into a full-fledged colored dark room in our dorm room. And but the interesting thing that we weren't very smart about construction, I guess, because being on the what floor were we on?
Third.
Third floor.
Yeah, third floor.
And we didn't take into account that the water, when they usually pump the water up to the top floor, and then by gravity, it's how they feed the rest of the things. And we realized that we had to cut these pipes. And we somehow made our way into the basement one evening, and we shut the water off to the dorm with these.
Cut the pipes.
Before we cut the pipe, we shut all the water off in the entire dorm, and then in the soon-to-be dark room, we had enough sense to close the door because we didn't want any noise. And my roommate, Ray Anard, and Ed Cobb went in there and cut the pipe. And all of a sudden, I guess all the water that was above them for the whole 6 or 7 floors come shooting out. And we heard them screaming. And we saw water running out underneath the door. So what we decided to do was grab as many towels as we could to stop the water from coming out, and
Not realizing they might be drowning
well,
in
we
there.
didn't care at that point. Well, anyway, we had a full-fledged color lab going. In fact, we got so bold that we actually were taking in film from the rest of the students. We had a bag. We had a bag outside our door they could drop off the film.
Now, aren't color labs much more complex than a black and white?
Yes.
I mean, it's not just.
Oh, yes.
Not a
Oh,
couple
yes.
tanks, no.
No, you
Oh,
need
yes.
some
No, no.
chemicals.
Oh, yeah, this was a full-fledged lab.
Right.
And,
They weren't doing the printing, but they were doing the processing of the film.
yeah,
Okay,
and
I
you
got
weren't
it.
you weren't even allowed to develop a roll of film in your bathroom.
Right.
With a little can.
Oh, they didn't want you to.
They
do
didn't
Oh,
want
no,
to
they
do
didn't
anything.
want you to do that because of the chemicals in the
Yeah.
drains and
And
stuff
then
like
and
that.
then one day there was a surprise visit by the floor advisors.
Well, you guys weren't there,
That's right. And
but you came back.
yeah.
Floor advisor.
The floor advisor didn't know what to do. He didn't know how he could tell that there was a full-fledged colored lab in
One floor below.
One floor
One
below.
floor below the director
Well,
of
anyway, what
housing.
happened was he wrote a letter, and I'm not. It goes on. It's in a way it's kind of humorous how they said that what. Well, it goes on and on, but I'm turning in this letter to the archivist. I gave you the photocopy of it, and our penalty was to be restricted for several weekends, and
With the exception of March 23rd, 1962.
well, why was that an exception?
I don't know.
There had to be
I
something
think,
going on.
I think it might have been the spring break.
Could have been.
Oh,
I
Could have been.
think they couldn't restrict you during spring break.
Yeah,
That's
something
when
like that.
School was
Yeah.
closed or something.
oh, I
Yeah.
like the last sentence too, but this should serve as a warning that if you should ever again become involved in disrespect or disregard of residence hall regulations, you might be asked to leave the institute. You
Yeah,
might.
Might.
Right,
Did they
Mike,
send a
yeah.
copy home to your parents?
No.
No. What, are you kidding?
Yeah. No.
These days, they probably would.
Oh, no.
Oh, they
no.
probably would, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that was kind of on the humorous side, but one thing that stuck out in my mind is we had Hollis Todd for optics, and Hollis was a very stickler for the way he ran his class. I mean, there was no messing around in Hollis time. And we had an optics exam, and it was in November, and he handed out all the exams, and we sat down and we started doing the exam, and Hollis left the room. And he came back in the room, and he walked up and down the aisle and grabbed all our exam papers and pulled them off our desks. And we didn't know what this was about. And he turned around and said, "They killed the president."
Oh,
And
November 23rd,
yeah,
Oh, gosh.
and
1963.
and the operative word there is they. So they killed the president, and he went out the room, and we all ran over to the Ritzkeller. And by that time, they had one black and white TV,
right.
and we were all around it. And I guess Cronkite came on, and all he had to do was take his glasses off, and he said, "The president's dead."
Oh.
And I remember that, like,
Well, of course you
Yeah.
were young. I mean,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
president meant a
Well,
lot to
everybody
young
does,
people.
yeah.
yeah, and that was kind of the end of Camelot for us, because
Yeah.
it was a wonderful time, and everything went sour after that.
Yeah.
It certainly did, didn't it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And in the on another note, on a little bit lighter note, and I'll talk about Operation Highball, which we've provided some background for. In 1962, again, in 1962, most of us were living in the dorm. In our junior year, 1963, all of us moved out of the dorm, and probably just in time before you guys got thrown out of the dorm and out of the institute. So we moved out of the dorm. Jim and three other guys rented a house on Woodbine Avenue, and myself and three other guys in photo rented a house on Hobart Street out in the west of downtown campus. Anyhow, in 1961, 62, our second year, some of the photoscience guys got the idea after they announced that they were going to build a new campus out here in Henrietta, that we ought to get some aerial photographs of the old campus. And instead of taking in the simple way out and hiring an airplane and flying over the campus and doing pictures, they decided that what they would do is they would launch some 17, 19-foot weather balloon, 30-foot weather balloons.
There's three of them. Yeah,
There were
of them.
three 30-foot weather balloons, something like that, filled with helium on a bar with a capsule, a styrofoam capsule, and a camera inside the styrofoam capsule with a small dynamite charge on a line.
Well, the dynamite, okay, what happened was, we were gonna have the balloon go up, take the pictures, and then when it reached a certain altitude, the dynamite would blow up the balloons, and it would come down by parachute.
Right, there was a parachute in it, yeah.
That was the plan.
That was the plan.
Now, who designed this plan? Did
Oh, we did-
somebody that
the-
knew?
the-
The photo,
the photo-
no.
No,
We got-
the photoscience class. In fact,
Right.
we have a movie, and it shows the planning.
Mm-hmm.
And while we were doing our thing, our nerdy tech thing, the real photography students were documenting it.
Two of us, George Cochran and I, did the black and white photographs. Of
So
the
it's very
other
well
thing.
documented.
Right.
And
All through the winter, they were working on it in the studio. But we had one engineering student, remember the one engineering student, electrical engineering student who helped with the remote control. We had to remotely fire the camera, remember?
oh yeah.
And we had to get him in, you guys had to get him in because of the electronics
Yeah.
expertise that he had. But that was really the only person outside of photo
Yeah. In
that
fact,
got involved with it.
in fact, we didn't even tell the administration.
No,
And, but the faculty was involved. As a matter of fact, it was just before that this Gary Powers was shot down with the U-2 spy plane
over
over
Soviet
Russia.
Union.
It was
Okay.
called U-2.
Uh-huh.
So our code name, when you think about it, it's almost embarrassing how nerdy we were, but what we did was we had our code name, and the code name was Z2 instead of U2, and the Z was for Zakia.
Now, why did you name it for Zakia?
Because it was a Z.
Why
like
Zakian?
Yeah, why Dick
Oh,
Zakian?
he was in on it from the beginning. He was probably the only
Yeah.
real faculty member that more or less, he's deceased now, but he encouraged us, right
Oh, yeah.
right down the line. And, well, anyway, we built this thing, and we did all the math, I guess if you want to call it that this thing was going to go up.
Well, we also got a whole bunch of companies to donate
Oh,
stuff.
yeah.
The weather balloons were everything was donated. We didn't pay anything.
Yeah, no, and this is
Out of
all
our pockets.
documented
Yeah,
in the
film.
movie, the film. And what happened at the last minute,
Well, the launch was scheduled for Friday afternoon of spring weekend.
that's good.
Okay.
Okay, we decided to get out there in this parking lot across from the Clark Building, across Spring Street from the Clark Building, and we would launch it from that parking lot because it was nice and wide open and we could get it blocked off and everything else. That would launch in the afternoon. We would take most of the day to fill these weather balloons with helium and everything else. It turned out to be an absolute scorcher of a day.
And then, no, but then we were informed that the FAA would not allow us to have this free-flying contraption, and they wanted it tethered with a rope. And we never really took into account the weight of the rope and the wind.
And the wind was dead all day long until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It started picking up and we were getting everything ready to go about 4, which we did, and the launch came at 4. Well, the
Yes.
wind was up, and now the weight of the rope and the wind, and it's blowing south toward.
That's when the divine intervention happened
The divine intervention came, and it blew over the church.
and wrapped itself.
And because of the weight of the rope, it pulled everything down, and it wrapped itself around the spire,
The church.
on the peak of the church roof.
And this is the
It got
church on
caught.
campus there.
On campus, right. At which point, of course, the fire department was called. They brought a hook and ladder truck up and put it on Spring Street, out into Plymouth Avenue, blocked off
Blocked off
Plymouth
the traffic.
Avenue. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Kodak office is letting out, and everybody wants to get back to Pittsford and Penfield. And so they're all blocked up. So
Well,
the DNC the next morning had a headline about the biggest traffic jam in history because of this goofy project that the
Well,
RIT did.
The firemen, they put up this, sorry, let me kill this. Irving.
Cell phone.
Irving, I have to call you back, okay? Okay, I'm sorry. Anyway, they put up this big hook and ladder up to the top of the steeple. And the firemen were gonna go up there
retrieve
and
the rope.
Go untangle it. And I was already there. And I told the fireman, I says, oh, by the way, there's dynamite on all the balloons. Well, he slowly backed down the ladder and had the students go up the ladder.
The students went up the ladder. Firemen standing
The
down
firemen
on
didn't
the
want to have
street.
anything to do with
He
it.
would-
Dynamite.
In the film, you'll see students up on the end of this hook and ladder at the peak of the roof of the church.
Grabbing the dynamite.
Yeah, yeah.
It never did blow, did it?
No.
Because it was an altitude sensitive,
Oh.
so it never
So
blew.
you had set it up somehow so that when
If it
it
got
reached a certain height.
Altitude, it would
But it
blow
was
and release.
whipping around the top of the church, and we thought it was gonna blow up and take the crucifix with it and everything else. And Ellingston showed up,
Right, Mark Ellington showed up. Right.
and there's a little thing there in the film, and he's looking at.
Now, he didn't show up
Shoemaker.
for but they were down there before.
Oh
That
yeah,
was
but,
during the day.
yeah, but anyway, that was called Operation
Did Ellington
Eyeball.
know about this?
Oh, yeah, he was
You're right.
there. He was there in the morning.
He was there, but he did not know prior.
He didn't know prior before that.
No prior
Okay.
before.
Yeah.
He didn't have
Well,
no idea that
we
you.
don't know that for
No,
sure,
oh,
but
yeah. And,
he showed up. We did announce it a week before or something that this is what we were going to do on that Friday of spring weekend.
yeah, and,
So we set spring weekend off really well that year.
we were also, we were the class where it was announced that they were coming out to Henrietta. And one of our members of class, unfortunately, he didn't come to this reunion.
Yeah, Bill Darrow.
His name is Bill Darrow, and the character. And on his own, he had a bunch of T-shirts printed up with the South Henrietta Institute of Technology with the same font that said SHIT.
Same logo too.
Oh, yeah.
Not the one you
Right,
had.
no, I know, the one we have is a later edition.
Yes, right.
And it was kind of a nice, funny little joke. And apparently Ellingson heard about it. And they called Darrow, Ellingson called Darrow into his office and said, "Are you the person responsible who made these T-shirts?" And Darrow kind of sheepishly said yes. And Ellingson said, "Could you get me 6 for the trustees?"
So the former board of trustees all got a.
So
South
Ellingson
Henrietta.
did have a sense of humor.
He did have a sense of humor. It may
Yeah.
not have come across right away, but
Yeah, no,
he certainly did.
No,
Yeah.
we had a good group. We had a really good group. And
Well, you have all kept, I mean, you've kept up with each other.
Yes,
Pretty
yes.
well.
Pretty
over
much
the
so,
years.
yeah.
yeah,
And
we lost too many.
Well,
Well, you've lost a few,
I
yeah.
figured about 20% of the class is actually, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, the class was about 50,
Mm-hmm.
and there are 10 who have not, roughly 10 who have not made it this far.
Yeah.
Dave Page, wasn't he
No,
in your?
Dave Page wasn't in our class.
They're
No.
both my roommates,
Ray Aynard,
Ray Aynard
Scotty
and
Wilson,
Scott Wilson.
George Pittman, Milt Pearson, who died just recently this spring,
Renee Ertz.
Renee Ertz, Holcomb Hughes, Dan Knoll has recently died. I have a list of them. I can't recall all of them. I got 7 of them. But
Were there any women?
no.
Not.
No, we didn't have
Not-
one woman. As a matter of
There was
fact, we
one-
spoke.
A woman by the name of Virginia Bissell,
Mm-hmm.
Bissell, I don't know, Bissell, started with us in the freshman year, but did not end up with us in our senior
No.
year.
It would probably be hard.
Yes.
I mean, it's like the women now in the engineering
Well,
programs. It's not.
yeah.
there was one, a female, and this was in perhaps our second or maybe our senior year. She came into the class. Elsie's.
Elsie something, yes.
Elsie
What was
something.
Elsie's name? Yes, Elsie was her first name, right?
And she humiliated all of us because she was so smart. We got rid of her real quick.
Didn't need that
They
competition.
were
No.
different
No.
days, weren't they?
Oh, they were, yeah.
Yes. As a matter of fact, yesterday we spoke to
Thursday.
about 30 students, and they're predominantly female.
Predominantly women.
In the
yeah.
photo program.
The photo program, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Which, and I talked to William Snyder about it, and he said, yeah, it's totally changed. When I was here teaching, there were more and more women through the 15 years that I was here up until '86, but it's now really flipped much the other way.
Does
So-
he have a theory as to why this is the case?
No, at least we haven't talked about a theory that he
No,
might have.
no.
No.
But one of the curious things, the only reason I kind of pulled them, because I teaching, and I went from the conventional photography to digital, and even in my teaching. And so I said, there's approximately 30 people in the class, and I said, how many of you have phones that you can take photos from? And of course, they all raised their hands. And then I picked some at random. I said, how many photos do you have on your phone? And it came out that averaged about 1,000 photos for each student. So you multiply that by the 30 students. So sitting out there with 30,000 images
in that room,
in that room.
roughly.
And
And the thing for me is, 10 years from now, how are they going to find them? And won't.
They aren't.
yeah,
And
I mean, they put all this up on Facebook. I mean, maybe Facebook, someone's gonna preserve that, not them, but,
yeah,
Right.
it-
Well,
potentially,
no,
but-
I think
no, I think the digital photos are going to disappear much easier. All you have to do is hit the delete button.
it's very true. And I think, and I talked to William about this too, Snyder about this too, and that is that there has to be an emphasis at least placed on background with these students, that they're going to have to be able to keep track of that metadata in order to retrieve the best photographs that they're doing now.
it'll be more selective.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean,
just edit their work.
When I left, even though I was in photo science, I was still taking photos. And I think maybe in the 4 years, I had maybe 10 images.
Keepers.
Keepers.
Yeah. Right.
okay?
Right, well, you're a student, right?
Oh, no, but only because it was difficult and it was expensive. And we had to be very, very judicious as to what you did
Yeah.
I mean, did the school supply you with chemicals?
No, well,
No.
chemistry, yeah.
Chemistry,
Yeah,
because
not
you had
film.
all the dark rooms and the.
Right, we had to buy our own film
Yeah,
and
we,
paper.
one
Right, they
thing,
still have to buy
is that
paper.
Right.
people ever, when you say oh, go up to RIT, they say, oh yeah, that's a Kodak school. As it
Right.
turns out, Kodak didn't do anything for us.
Mm-hmm.
The only
Data
per-
books. Data books.
Yeah, data books, but the only people who ever gave us any material to work with was
Xerox.
Xerox.
Yeah.
And it was terrible.
When it was haloid Xerox.
Yeah.
Oh,
They would
really?
give us paper, haloid Xerox paper,
Yeah.
and it was 8x10 multi-grade paper.
Oh, yeah, well,
You know, it was-
but the thing is, everybody assumed that we were part of Kodak, and
Yeah.
we weren't.
No.
No.
And Kodak, for all good reason, George Eastman did in fact say, don't give away your product at some point. I think I heard that. But the other thing was that they didn't want to treat us any differently than any of the other schools in the Rochester area as far as how they treated us. So they didn't want to be seen as doing more for RIT
Right.
than they would do for St. John Fisher or U of R or anybody else.
The facilities here, how were they?
Where?
Here, I
State of-
mean, like,
Oh, I don't know.
oh, no, I don't mean here, but when you, downtown.
Downtown. Well, they were state of the art, quote unquote, state of the
Right.
art.
I mean, they were built in the.
The whole
40s or
photo
40s, yeah.
department, the whole photo department was probably about the size of the cafeteria.
Yeah, the third floor of the Clark Building.
Yeah, the third floor of the
I mean,
Clark
I've seen
building.
studios.
Right.
Yeah.
There were studios, there were
Dark
dark rooms.
rooms.
Yes.
They had color dark rooms.
Used color.
They had black and white film. Off the studios, there were black and white film processing rooms where you would go in and process your black and white film.
Yeah.
And they had color photography that Ed Wilson and Bob Bagby taught, both color theory and color practice, if you will.
Well, what was interesting is that even though there were different programs, pro photography, photo illustration, photo science, the instructors were very open to having different programs sit in their class. And so if you planned it right, you were able to not only take your technical courses, but also take some of the more aesthetic courses. So it was really nice. It was a nice setup.
And I think
Because you
that-
learned photography. I mean, you didn't just study photoscience. You.
Oh,
learned
the
how
first
to-
2 years, everyone more or less took the same course.
Same
Okay.
courses. Then you
Ah,
then you
and
split
then you
off into
split up.
Yeah.
photoscience and illustration. So you did shooting in the first 2 years. You were doing studio work, you were doing field work and stuff like that. Then the third and fourth year is when you split off into the
And specialized.
Yeah.
specialized. Now the other thing is that at that time in 1964, I come from a small town in Pennsylvania, and I wanted to go to school for photography. My guidance counselor didn't know anything about RIT. I had to do the research, and I only found RIT through
Right, there wasn't-
Popular Photography magazine because there weren't any other schools doing it other than New York Institute of Photography, which was doing home study courses by mail order course work. But you didn't get a degree, you got a certificate kind of thing. There were schools on the West Coast. There was the Art Institute on the West Coast that was in business then. The Chicago Art Institute, I think, had some photo programs at that time, but there were very
Right.
few programs going on that were viable, and certainly none as well equipped as RIT
Right.
was.
And not the photoscience and not,
No, not the
photo
No, no,
illustration,
what
like you were
happened-
doing sort of
no, what-
photojournalism.
yeah,
It was more
what-
probably
No,
art.
we weren't doing photojournalism. No, I learned
more
photojournalism
more
afterwards.
advertising?
Advertising was very
That
much
was
the
the
focus.
focus,
Oh, yeah,
okay.
yeah, it was very much New York oriented.
What happened?
Or fine art.
What happened in, I think it was 58 or 59 or 57, Russia sent up Sputnik.
Oh, it's 57 the year of my birth, yes.
Okay, it was 1957, Sputnik went up, and it just shocked the United States that they were so ahead of us. And then all of a sudden, science was the thing. If you wanted to be some sort of hero, it was science.
Yeah,
And
Yeah, not for me, because I knew my grades in high school.
so one of the things that, even though I'd started doing photography when I was like 14 years old in the studio, the thought of doing something like, photo science, and there was a lot of glamour involved with the astronauts and the space
Right.
program and all that sort of
You
thing.
picked up on that as a
Oh
child.
yeah, oh, absolutely. Not only, oh sure, and then when we came up here, there was kind of a push to get us into photo science by some of the organizations. Is that a safe way of
Yeah,
putting it?
yeah, right.
Yeah.
There were,
What
We
organization?
call them the spooks.
yeah, the spooks. I mean, if you look at the graduates and where they went, graduates of photoscience,
Yeah.
64, 63, 64, 65, they were going to a whole bunch of different companies. Then they were feeding back into
The government.
into the whole operation. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Kevin Gilson, one of the guys in
Well,
photoscience,
half the people here that came to this reunion,
did
they
some
still,
sort
they
of
still
work.
probably can't talk about some of the things they did.
Oh yeah, I mean, Kevin Gilson worked with the first images, the digital images coming back from a satellite in space, and telling the story that they didn't have any way to display these images because the IBM 360 computer, which was the state of the art, could only handle 2 lines of code. Then it would freeze up from these things, and they had to print them out on photographic paper in order to show people what digital images looked like from space.
No, we were talking,
Wow.
which is jog my memory. I know we're probably running way over, but
Yeah, we gotta-
One little quick story. My roommate Scott and I, we had to go to I think it was probably a very important test, an exam or something. Okay, and the way that the dorm was set up, there was actually a bar in the bottom of the dorm.
Well, next door,
Right, no, yeah, right next door.
right next door, right.
And we were watching a little black and white TV, and we had to go to an exam. And what happened was the President, Kennedy, made a blockade around Cuba. And the Russian ships were coming with the missiles on them. And he said that if they break that blockade, there's going to be a war. That means
Yes,
bombs were going to start
right.
flying. So Scotty and I, we were all set to go, and we went into the bar. We said, "What's the sense of going to class? There's going to be a war." So we watched live. They had a live feed of the ships turn around.
Really?
Yeah.
We were all prepared
Were you
to.
scared?
We were in the bar.
You were
Were you
drunk?
scared?
No, we wasn't
We're ready to
scared.
get drunk.
We figured this is I mean, why go take an exam if we were going to all turn into cinder in a matter of hours? So.
It was
I
it
would
was a
think it would
passing
be a
fad.
little,
It wasn't quite that, not quite like that, but anyhow.
Yeah. Anyway,
Thank you.